Good morning. I'm R.T. Ryback. I'm CEO of the Minneapolis Foundation, and we're really excited to have you with us this morning. There are about 200 plus of you from around the state of Minnesota, and you are people, as we understand it, who all care very much about our kids and are improving our education outcomes. But you're also people who potentially joined us at some of our earlier convenings in our Reimagine Education work. The work is really around not only changing what we do in school, but really how we do education and how we support our kids. And what we mean by that is that too often over these last few years, we've all had different ideas about what to do with our kids. And the problem is we need to figure out a way to work together. So the Reimagine work has really done some pretty dramatic efforts in trying to realign the way we talk and work together for our kids. What that's meant is that a couple of years ago, the Minneapolis Foundation, we took a body of work called Reimagine Minnesota. It was put together by every metropolitan superintendent, and they came together and said, what would they do if somebody asked them about how to improve education equity? We then built on that by bringing together a panel of about 1,000 young people, primarily kids of color, telling us what would they do to add a student voice into that work. So now we had educators and students. We built community into that. We then convened school boards from around the state of Minnesota who added their voice into the work. And then what we did is something that we were extremely excited about, is that working with Stephanie Kraft, who was then with the governor's office and is now an assistant commissioner, and with Patrice Relaford, who's led this work at the Minneapolis Foundation, we put together a panel of 20 people who care a lot about education equity from around the state. The governor chose them. They weren't chosen because they got along. They were chosen because they all cared, and they cared about doing deep work. We worked with them, developed a plan that came out of that. That then influenced the governor's Due North education strategy. We also, during this process, have added in the research from the University of Minnesota, led by Dr. Michael Rodriguez, who said, these are your ideas. What does the research show? When COVID hit, we then added that on top to say, what do we do with distance learning? And all of this is a body of work you can find on our website at the Minneapolis Foundation. But now today, we're in an incredible position because the federal government has passed a Recovery Act that is going to put an enormous amount of resource into the economy, but more important, into our kids. So we're going to hear from people on the front lines of doing that work, from our senator and also from our commissioner of education. So we're awfully excited to have them here today. After they're done, they'll be joined by their team members in a Q&A. So we'll have an opportunity to have questions for them. So we're very excited to start this. We want to welcome a great friend of the foundation who's spoken to us on climate and other issues, and she's Senator Tina Smith. Senator Smith's been very involved in this work, and we want to say welcome, Tina, Senator, and please take it away.
Good morning, everyone. And you can hear Archie and I, actually, we will just call each other Tina and Archie because we've known each other, we've worked together, we've been dear friends for a long time. So I'm really grateful to RT and to the Minneapolis Foundation and also the Graves Foundation, as I understand, for bringing us all together today. And thank you so much, RT, for the work that you are doing on reimagining education. And I want to just say at the outset that, as you know, I'm always, as you know me so well, I'm always looking for the silver lining in the catastrophe. And I do believe that as much of a catastrophe as COVID-19 has been, the silver lining is around the innovation that has been happening out of necessity in all sorts of fields, including in education, because of COVID. So I'm interested in learning a little bit about that as we go through this conversation. I also want to thank Commissioner Mueller and Assistant Commissioner Graff for, particularly at this incredibly busy time of year, for joining us. And I want to make sure that everybody knows my incredible staff on the call, who are true subject matter experts and will be able to answer your questions so well. I'm Amy Johnson-Corba and Brennan Barber. Amy is in Minnesota and Brennan is in my office in Washington, D.C. And I just want to also say thank you to all of you educators and education leaders that are on this call. it's almost incomprehensible to think of a year that could have provided more challenges than the year that we have all faced, and you in particular have faced over these last 13 months. And I know that you have brought your whole heart and mind and intellect and everything that you've got into this challenge. And I know also that it's taken a real toll, not only on students and families, but also on you. So I'm really grateful for you. And I'm hoping that this conversation will give you some sense of the my priorities in this fight over the last year, which has really been to do everything I can to bring resources to you so that you can do really, really good work. So let me just start with the pandemic and acknowledge that this has been a public health and an economic earthquake that has shaken every part of our lives, including our schools. And that the pandemic has not been the great equalizer, right? It has disproportionately hurt and affected those that were already struggling without a safe place to live, without good nutrition, people dealing with the systemic inequities in our community that reveal themselves across the board, including in our education systems. I'm thinking about a farmer from southern Minnesota who said, with the pandemic, we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. And I think that that really dramatizes the deep challenges that we're facing. And of course, you have been responding to that in real time with having to make dramatic shifts in how students are learning, adapting, the innovation that you've had to bring. And it's been an incredible challenge. And I have to also say that in 2020, you did this with a significant lack of a federal strategy and very mixed messages about safety, which I think has contributed to turning your work into even more of a political football than it needed to be. Nonetheless, Congress did make important steps with the CARES Act to really support your work. And with the American Rescue Plan, I think that we have provided some really bold and potentially transformational support and resources to help you in your work, not only in the short term, but I think also, I hope, paving the way in the long term for where we can go from here with education. So let me just talk a little bit about it, and then I'll turn the floor back to RT. Just say a few words about the American Rescue Plan. So the American Rescue Plan, as you probably know, included $125 billion for public K through 12 schools. That includes $1.3 billion for Minnesota schools. These dollars can be used to fill budget gaps created by the unexpected expenses that you face, whether that be personal protective equipment or technology or cleaning. But it also can be used to meet the long-term academic, social, and emotional needs of the students that you serve. I led efforts in the American Rescue Plan to allocate $1.25 billion, that's a national number, for summer enrichment programs, and $1.25 billion for after-school programs. We thought that this was so important this coming summer, both to help students recover from the learning kind of deficits that have happened over the last year, but also we hope to provide all sorts of creative and community-based strategies for students to get reconnected, and also just to sort of rebuild their emotional resilience after what has been a particularly hard year, especially for students who are already struggling with some of these systemic inequities in our society. So this is about not only helping students to catch up academically, but also to help strengthen resilience around physical health and mental health, emotional health. This leads me to another thing that I think is really important about these dollars, a priority of mine, which has been to get additional support for mental health services in schools. This is a longstanding need that we have, and I hope that these dollars, these American Rescue Plan dollars, can help to support that work that I'm sure all of you are deeply aware of that need and have been doing a lot of work on the ground to meet that need. We know that Minnesota is, although we are a bastion of progressive values, we also are home to some of the worst economic, racial disparities of any place in the country. And this reveals itself in our classrooms. Though the challenges that families face are not created in those classrooms, they are brought to those classrooms. And so I want to just close by saying that the American Rescue Plan, I believe, has the transformational ability to address some of those systemic inequities. Just for an example, the child tax credit, which will reduce child poverty in this country by about 50%. Now our challenge as we move forward is to make sure that these big leaps forward are permanent and not just go by the wayside when the American Rescue Plan ends. And that's what we're going to be working hard on as we move forward with legislation over the rest of this year. So RT, this is a story about innovation. It's a story about support, finally, from the federal government for education, and also about what we can do with this going forward to make sure that some of these innovations can actually be carried forward and have a lasting difference in the lives of students.
Thanks so much, Senator. My mind is blown with that idea that you can reduce child poverty in half, which is just astonishing, especially when we recognize the link between poverty and education outcomes. So that's great. One of the things also I just wanted to before I turn it over to the commissioners, thank you for that thinking about out of school time. We've had some really interesting conversations with school leaders talking about the fact that they recognize the gap in learning. When they're trying to do summer programming, they also have this challenge of not only staff, but also space, the social distancing. So you've got this whole out of school network with space and people and all that. So the more we can tie that together, the better.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Well, it's really, this is about, it's like a whole person. It's your physical health, your emotional and mental health, and then your academic health too. And you can't divide that up. And I know that people who are working in schools see that every single day, and we need to build that into our policy more. Thanks so much. Commissioner, we're thrilled to have you with us today, and we just so appreciated your partnership as we've been working on this Reimagine work. We're also really excited that you're creating a position within the department to focus specifically on equity, and the work we did in the roundtable for the governor, really working on anti-racist education policies is we hope a bit of a roadmap for where that goes. So we just are very energized by your work. I want to thank you for coming. And so when you hear the senator and hear where she's going, and you think about where we should go as a state, what can you share with us?
Well, first, I wanted to say thank you very much for inviting me to be able to join. And I too just want to introduce my team that's on here. We do have Assistant Commissioner, and you had alluded to that she had worked with you all, I think, when she was in the governor's office, but she is at the Department of Education now as an Assistant Commissioner for Educational Opportunity, and Assistant Commissioner Stephanie Graff. And we also have our Director of Communications, Ashley Norris, on with us as well. And so we just really appreciate having the opportunity to come and connect with all of you. As you know, I think our school leaders have been able to do things that are nothing short of remarkable. We have asked not only our school leaders, but our educators, our families, our communities, and most importantly, our students to really, I think, band together in a way that we've never had to do before and think about education in a completely different way. And I think we've all talked about the fact that there are great benefits to in a completely different way to think in this way. And it really gives us the opportunity to recognize a couple of things. One, first and foremost, is that most people think of education as something that is more stagnant and very slow to move. And what we were able to see in 2020 is that it is not at all stagnant, and it is actually quite quick to move. When we needed to, our school leaders, our communities, our teachers, our students and families were able to shift the way that we have done school in a matter of 8 days and respond incredibly quickly. And we know that we have found that there are gaps in the way that we were able to deliver instruction. And so over the summer, people worked to ensure that we found other ways and additional ways to provide technology and access to ensure that our students and families had the support that they needed, creating things like school age care in order to ensure that we were trying to meet the needs of every single student. And I think it also became crystal clear how important our schools are in our communities. We serve and promote and provide access, participation, representation for our students, not only in academics, but social, emotional health, physical health, nutritional health, right? In every single component and facet of a student's life we have found in the schools. And so I think that that's one of the things that we've been able to identify is that the role that we schools play and educators play in our communities can never be undersold. And as a result, we have to think about how we also can continue moving forward with recognizing, I think, the reform that we need to be able to do for each and every student. Our work as a system is to eliminate barriers and eliminate systems that are created not for every single person, but for a very few, that can be created for a very few group of people. And so in that, that means that the funding that we've talked about really comes in the way that we think about it historically in three buckets. The funding that we've seen coming out to ensure relief, that we have recovery, and that we also have reform. So at the beginning of the pandemic, the CARES Act really provided our resources for sanitizing, ensuring that staff had personal protective equipment, that staff were retained, and that students and staff were supported in their distance learning efforts. We also know in that point in time that we had students that we found that although we had some that struggled, that did incredibly well, that they found their strengths in the ability to be able to really thrive in a distance learning model. And as a result, our schools are thinking about new ways in that reform package bucket that we think about really, and how is it that we're going to be able to continue to provide that type of learning and support for students who really thrive in that way. In another place we think about is recovery. Really, that second round of funding that we've seen was really focused on beginning to counteract the effects of lost learning time in a classroom and focusing on returning to in-person learning for our schools that didn't have in-person learning. Now, we do know that there are schools throughout our state that did have the opportunity to have in-person learning for the vast majority of their school year. And then for our students that did not, for a variety of reasons, we want to make sure that we are amenable and flexible and adaptable to what our students and communities need. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all approach in our recovery, and it's not a one-size-fits-all in the way that we think about reform, right? And so we want to create systems and structures that are based in equity, but are also recognizing the differences in our communities and the personalities of each of our sites. And so with that, really this third phase gives us the opportunity to really look longer term and think about how we can strengthen our connections in our schools even more than before we had when the pandemic hit. It's really an opportunity to make some of these long-term changes in how we think about education based on all of the lessons that we've learned. Again, we know that education has been underfunded for almost, I think, its entirety. And so if we really want to take this opportunity to look at our funding and think about ways that we can do things differently, this is our time, right? That there has been great tragedy that has come as a result of a part of the pandemic. But I think what we've also seen is there is great opportunity, and it's our obligation to our students, to our families, and to our communities to seize on the opportunity and to really think about the needs of each and every student, and every single day that they know that they're seen, valued, and heard for who they are and what they bring into their classroom, that they are represented, and that we're going beyond talking about access. We're saying that we not only want to provide access for each and every student, we want to make sure that each and every student is participating. Right? Opportunities are one thing, access is another, but real deep participation and representation of our students, of our communities, and so that they see and hear themselves in everything they do, that's really what we're talking about. And so eliminating those systemic barriers, talking, I think, to your point, RT, about thinking on how is it that we've worked right through the governor's roundtable to really put forward that Due North plan, thinking about anti-racist and anti-bias practices. How are we thinking about trauma-informed instruction? How are we lifting up and ensuring that we have not only demographic, we're recognizing that we have demographic representation, but also geographic representation and diversity. And so really taking a holistic approach in the way that we think about education, but most importantly, just making sure that we are really student-centered in every decision we make. And although this is one of the things we've talked about consistently, as we're even walking into this legislative session, quite honestly, is that people who are sitting in education and doing this work, we're going to walk in with the assumption that we are doing this because we believe that we want to put our students at the center, that they matter more than almost anything else. And so as we're doing this work, we may come at it differently, but we know that we're coming at it for the same reasons and the right reasons. And so that gives us the opportunity to really be thoughtful in our work and try to find as much opportunity for collaboration and cohesion as possible, because our students deserve the best.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And so let's bring in Amy and Brennan and Stephanie and get ready for our Q&A. I also want to, Patrice, I hope you'll turn your camera on. Patrice Relaford, who leads our education work. While I lead the foundation, Patrice leads our Reimagine education work. So I work for her on this initiative, and she's going to be monitoring the chat as well. One of the things that is really important to us at the Minneapolis Foundation and to the Graves Foundation, I think to many, that came out of this, certainly the work we've done, is the idea of diversifying the teacher corps. There are many young people of color who can go through their entire education experience without ever having anyone who looked like them at the front of their classroom. And when Dr. Michael Rodriguez was analyzing what distance learning has meant, he said, you know, one small upside, but it's an important one, is that for the first time in their entire academic experience, kids who are learning at home with a parent there are learning their history through the lens of someone of the same culture, which is a really interesting insight and also a jarring one to think how incredibly far behind we are in diversifying the teacher corps. Is there anything in any of this work that can specifically help us move forward on hiring more teachers of color?
Brennan, did you want to take that one? Or Commissioner? Absolutely.
No, so Senator Smith, I think she was speaking and she was on mute. So I was just going to.
Sorry, I forgot. I very carefully muted myself so you wouldn't all hear Archie Smith making his second cup of coffee. I want to just say very quickly that I think this is such an important point, and the beauty, I think, of these federal dollars is that they provide so much flexibility for local districts and states to be able to accomplish what they think is really important. I also want to just mention that I've sponsored legislation myself that would provide specifically incentives to help teachers of color and move into the education workforce. And I especially am a big fan of the pipeline model of doing that. So you take people who are already in education, but maybe don't have a teaching credential and be able to move them forward. So this is exactly the kind of innovation that we need to be pursuing. And I'm going to turn it over to Brennan and Amy because I'm going to have to get off, but I wish you all a happy day and so grateful to you, RT, for bringing us all together.
Thanks so much, Senator. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go to the, let's talk a little bit about, we know that similar sized districts across Minnesota and the US are receiving widely variable amounts of money because of the distribution formula. This is for Senator Smith's staff. Can you tell us exactly what information was used to calculate the Title I funding formula and why this was the preferred allocation?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Again, I'm Brennan Barber with Senator Smith's office. I can share a little bit more about that. In all the tranches of aid that we've had go out the door, by that I mean the 3 different bills that have been passed and signed into law, all have basically used the Title I-A formula. The Title I-A formulas, it's actually 4 formulas, and they date back to the original federal investment in K-12 education from the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. And the role of federal funding in that law and kind of going forward is traditionally very targeted. And so as it has been with each of these bills and including the American Rescue Plan, they're extremely targeted towards the neediest students. And what that means as a practical purpose is that the federal funding goes out to the state level, and then from the state level, it goes to the LEA level, districts, based upon Title I-A formulas. And from there, it goes out to schools on the basis of free and reduced price lunch percentages. These aren't exactly equivalent, although we're talking about poverty and needy students. They're not comparing FERPL rates and the data that goes into the Title I-A formulas are not completely, it's not quite an apples to oranges comparison. I've certainly gotten questions on that before. And I think, people are making those comparisons because we're talking about poverty, but what goes under the hood on each of those are a little bit different. So the Title 1A formulas and what goes out from MDE essentially to districts is based upon census data, and it's administrative data, it's SNAP data, it's income, tax data, and this is for school district allocations. Now, we don't have that type of level of fine-grained data for individual schools, however, though, which get much, much smaller, right? So for that, the money is then going out on FERPL data. And FERPL is certainly very important measurement. It's a little tougher to be as exactly precise with that because of issues around self-reporting. Community eligibility provisions have made FERPL data a little more complicated, and so on. But the big picture, I think that's important to sort of keep in mind with regards to how this is going out is that the federal investment in K-12 education has traditionally not been a majority of funding, K-12 funding, right? We know the majority of K-12 funding comes from state and local governments. And so the federal investment is really meant to, and in the formulas, it targets the neediest students and the districts with the highest numbers of those students, and then the highest concentrations of those students. So that's partially a reason why we're seeing such differences. The other thing, and we can talk about this more as we get into some of the differences between each of the tranches of aid, is that with the American Rescue Plan, the state, MDE, has significantly less discretion than they have in previous funding. This is not unique to MDE, this is all states because of the state allocations and reservations, which I can get into a little bit more. But we can certainly, whereas states have been able with past previous tranches of aid, been able to make up some of that difference, the state with the ARP aid has less flexibility than they have had in previous funding.
Maybe this feeds into that, but what are the key differences between the ESSER funds from the ARP and then the first two rounds of ESSER funding from the CARES Act?
Yeah, thank you. So just, big picture, we've had essentially 3 tranches of dollars going out the door. We had, in March 2020, a little over a year ago now, we had the CARES Act. Nationally, we provided $13 billion for K-12 education, which certainly sounded like a lot at the time, but lo and behold was not as much as was ultimately needed and continues to be needed. Of that, Minnesota got about $140 million. Then we had the December law that was passed, which has a terrible acronym. So I won't use the acronym. I'll just call it the December law. Nationally, we provided almost $54 billion for K-12 education. Minnesota got $588. And then with the ARP, as Senator Smith noted, it's almost $125 billion for K-12 education. And of that, Minnesota is getting, the much larger number than the previous tranches of aid, that $1.3 billion. Some key things about the ARP and what is different than the December bill is the state and local aid in ARP is really robust. The December bill actually included $0 for state and local aid. In the ARP, we have $2.5 billion and $2.1 billion for Minnesota state and local aid together, respectively. That's a major difference with the ARP. Additionally, with the ARP, we have some specific directions. And as you can see, as we've gone on in this pandemic for a year, we've learned more there. You can think of these as refinements as we've gotten into the allowable uses, have gotten a little more specific, and the focus has shifted a little bit as we've learned more about what COVID has been like for educators and students, as we've learned more about the virus itself. So the major differences with the ARP funding is that state reservation is much smaller. So the dollars essentially are coming from the federal level, and they are going to the state. And what the state gets, 90% of that needs to go out to LEAs, to school districts. With that 10% that's left, whereas under previous bills, we've had a lot of flexibility there. MDE has been able to have a lot of discretion. This one with ARP dollars, they have a lot less. And so that's where we get that 5% on learning loss, and the 1% on after school, and then the 1% on summer enrichment. So that's a significant difference. And then also at the district level, we have 20% needs to be spent on learning loss. The learning loss activities are pretty broadly defined. There's considerable flexibility, but there's been a lot of focus over the last several months and a lot of concerns about learning loss. And so that's probably the biggest difference with the ARP dollars for district level.
I think mind if I jump in for a second, Patrice?
Yeah.
Here, okay. I think Brennan, that is incredibly helpful context. And I think just one piece that I maybe would expand on as I think about the difference between ARP and the first two rounds. And Commissioner Mueller touched on this, and so did Senator Smith, right? But the first round of funds really were focused on like the immediate response needs, right? So it was a lot of dollars around cleaning and sanitation, right? And building as safe and healthy of a learning environment as possible. Staffing needs, certainly needs around distance learning support, right? As so many districts shifted to distance learning. And then as we think about the second round, we sort of pivoted a little bit. There was some of that, right? So the supporting some of the immediate response needs, but it started to begin focusing on sort of some of that initial recovery, right? When it comes to sort of addressing learning loss. And then as I think about this third round, I think we have a real opportunity, right? I mean, the law says that it's returning to in-person learning. And I think if we frame it really well, we can really support some reform efforts, right? That will outlast some of the immediate needs that we know districts are navigating, right? And addressing. And so we're really, at MDE, encouraging schools to think strategically as they plan for recovery. And then also as they plan for reform, right? To build the long-term infrastructure. And I mean, these dollars, the timeline for spending is longer, right? It's up until September 2024. And so, that I think sends a clear signal around like, this is long-term infrastructure planning around reform. And this can include things, right? Like community connections and partnerships, and just a variety of efforts that really support the whole child, from which we can really create long-lasting change, right? When it comes to sort of reforming and improving the system. And so that's how, just sort of in my mind, as I think about the differences between ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 and sort of where we are now with opportunity with ARP funds.
Yeah, Stephanie, that is a really great framing, and I totally agree that the time frame of what was going on when developing each of these bills and what ultimately passed is really important. And as we've learned more, and that immediate response versus versus the concept of building back better, and so on. So absolutely, I think that's really helpful. One thing I did not mention is going through is with each of the different tranches. You're right, the time frame of spending has shifted with each of them. So the CARES money is September 2021, the December bill, September 2022, and the ARP is 2023. That's without the tidings amendment timeframe, which MD, I don't know if Stephanie, if you want to elaborate on that, that's a kind of a wonky 12-month extension of those dates.
I think for this conversation, Brennan, that is right. It's pretty typical for our federal dollars for us to extend for an additional 12 months to get the full 27 months of use for those dollars. So it does bring it then to September 2024, which presents a great opportunity to think about building long-term infrastructure, as we had talked about.
I just want to jump in on one thing. I think it's important to also note, if it's okay. Is that okay? Okay, I think that one thing is that we have been able to allocate the 90% of the funds for this last round coming out has just come out. We do have 9.5% that is still with the LAC. And I think we've walked through with our school leaders before what that process looks like, but the LAC has released the funds for the 90%. We are still working to have the 9.5% released. And within that, then we have the opportunity to be a little bit flexible, and we also have expectations that we need to meet the need. Also, I think it's important to note that since these were released, I think closer to the end of March, we have last week gotten a plan from the U.S. Department of Education that needs to be submitted by every state education agency, and then followed up by every local education agency with very specific data in the use of those 90% and the 9.5% specifically. And so that is work that we are continuing to do. Again, the plan was just released at the end of the week last week, so we're learning a little bit more about what that looks like, and we'll be sharing that with our school leaders. But the 90% we have been able to do, and we're looking at the flexibility and the ability to do that 9.5%, recognizing that the needs of students in every district, again, has been hit very differently. And also, we also know we have students who are historically underserved in every single district. And so our ability to meet needs in that way is something we're really being thoughtful about.
Thank you. For the next question, I want to pivot and stay with MDE. So Stephanie, can you talk a little bit about maintenance of effort and maintenance of equity as it relates to ARP funding? So for example, can districts or schools use some of the funding to offset IDEA special education costs? And if they did that, will they be negatively impacted?
Yeah, thanks, Patrice. And this does get pretty technical, so I'll give sort of a high-level overview, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop into the chat an email inbox that MDE staff are available and happy to sort of answer specific questions around maintenance of effort and maintenance of equity, how it intersects with IDEA, right, and some of those specific pieces within your local context. But sort of in general, at a statewide level, the ARP law does have a provision for maintenance of effort, which is pretty standard, right, for federal funds. And it does require that states continue to fund our K-12 education system at least at the proportional levels of average annual funding for fiscal years 2017, 2018, and 2019. And we're still diving into this at this point, but from what we can tell right now, it is likely, just based on where we are with sort of state funding, that Minnesota will not be able to meet this requirement. And so we are, again, diving in deeper, making sure that we fully understand these provisions as the law is new, but we are exploring an option to potentially file for a waiver with the federal government. And then the maintenance of effort, the maintenance of equity provision in ARP does require that in future years, 2022 and 2023, that high need districts across the state are protected from any state spending reductions. And so we'll keep a close look on that to be sure that that we are protecting those high need districts as defined and with the parameters within the federal ARP law. So those are the state pieces. At the LEA or school or district level, the maintenance of equity provision in ARP does require that LEAs do not decrease per pupil funding or staffing levels for their high poverty schools by an amount that exceeds district-wide reductions. And so a specific school cannot have per pupil funding or staffing levels, if they are a high poverty school, decreased at an amount that exceeds, again, the reductions that may be exhibited district-wide. And there are some exceptions to these pieces for particularly small schools or districts with fewer than 1,000 students, or for single school LEAs. And so for charter schools, for example, that may be a single school LEA. And then there are some, flexibilities for seeking an exemption if there are sort of uncontrollable circumstances when it comes to maintaining equity at a local level with regards to funding and staffing. And so I'll pause there. I would encourage, again, this gets really contextualized and it can get really technical, and we want to be sure that we are we're supporting school leaders as you navigate some of the MOE pieces and again, how it intersects with IDEA within your context. And so I'll pop the email inbox in the chat so that you have that. And please feel free to reach out. Our team at MDE stands ready to support.
Thank you, Stephanie. So while you're putting in that in the chat and before I move to the next question, I just want to let people know we're monitoring the Q&A in the chat and we'll follow up as we can. We're going to send an email after this that will have a link to the recording. And just like, again, feel free to reach out to MDE at the email address that Stephanie has provided in the chat. For the next question, I want to turn it back to Senator Smith's team, Brennan. But Stephanie, feel free if you have other thoughts on this one. But I'm wondering if Brennan, if you could walk us through like the general, like the big buckets of allowable uses. And then a specific question that we've heard is if districts choose to use some of the funding to increase the pay of their teachers and staff as a means of stabilizing the workforce, is that acceptable? Is that allowable?
Yeah. First, let me tag on a little bit to what Stephanie described on the MOE, just to say that, you know, which was an excellent description, and I'm really glad for the offer of technical help, as this does get very technical and is going to be really important, those local contextual issues. The MOE, both the maintenance of effort and equity provisions are, you know, were really born out of unfortunately, the lessons of the last recession and 2008 and the cuts that we saw to K-12 education at that point, and a desire to not repeat some of what's happened in the past. So that's kind of where those originated from. So I just wanted to share that. And then I would also note that with ARP, we were very glad to see there was also IDEA funding in the ARP, which had not been the case in previous tranches. It was $3 billion nationally, which is not enough, but we are glad that there's some dedicated IDEA dollars in there from the federal perspective. And then I will actually turn this allowable uses over to my colleague, Amy. She can get a chance to answer this.
Yeah, thank you, Brennan. Thanks for the question, Patrice. So I think when we finish up here, part of what we will share out is some information directly from the U.S. Department of Ed, that so you can have reference. But the big buckets of allowable uses are the things that Commissioner Mueller has been talking about and Assistant Commissioner Graff. The things you need to do to keep your school environment safe and clean, all the PPE, those things are still allowed. The specific learning loss piece we will talk about, I think, as we move forward, because that is really, really important. But learning loss, and we'll talk about what that broadly means. You have the third allowable use is things that address the disproportionate impact of COVID on our students of color and low-income students. And so that is an allowable use, the after-school and out-of-school time funding specifically. The next allowable use is to address the mental health needs of students, which can include hiring additional mental health providers, counselors, or expanding training for your staff that you have. How are we building in social emotional practices in our whole curriculum? So that is pretty broadly defined. There is an allowable use to integrate more student supports, including the use of full service community schools. The next allowable use is evidence-based summer learning and enrichment, including partnering with community-based organizations. And I think we can talk a little bit more about what that will really look like too. The technology needs that we've talked about, and all of you are very aware, there's still funding allowed to address some of those technology needs. The stabilizing and diversifying the educator workforce, Patrice, to your specific question, that is allowable. Yes, I do think that you could use that to pay the teachers that you have, but I also think that, interestingly, you could think about stabilizing that teacher workforce by being creative with how you're using the staff that you have. So maybe that looks like scheduling your day in a way that teams can be planning together so that they can be partnering, or stacking your enrichment classes so that the core teams have time to plan together. So what are the sustainable practices that you could build within your school day so that the teachers that you have are feeling supported? The next bucket is support services for students experiencing homelessness. That got a specific call out. And the final thing is that broad catch-all category, anything that is allowed under ESSA, Perkins, and IDEA, which is sort of the last big bucket.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks, Brennan. For the next question, I want to turn back to MDE. So Stephanie, I'm thinking about learning recovery and learning loss with this question. How should districts and schools be thinking about meeting the requirements to address learning loss or learning recovery for their students? Can the learning loss or learning recovery dollars be used only in the summer, only once? And can or should the communities consider after school or Saturday school opportunities as addressing learning loss? And then are there any other promising practices that could be considered?
Yeah, this is a great question. Thanks, Patrice. I mean, everybody here on the call, right, knows that throughout the past year and a little over, almost 2 months, I guess, almost 14 months, which is wild to think about. But throughout the pandemic, right, like students have missed out on so many opportunities to apply their learning, to deepen their understanding through relationships with peers, adults, trusted mentors, right, educators, and so many hands-on learning opportunities and experiential learning opportunities in particular really were lost. And so with sort of that framing, we're really encouraging our districts and schools across the state to really think about how can we meet the needs of the whole child to recover some of the instructional time, right? And really strengthen student connections within their community. And so, districts and schools really should design opportunities that take advantage, as the question talks about, right? This sort of extra time that may be, sort of outside of sort of traditional school hours. And so the ARP law specifically talks about, evidence-based before and after school programming, programming during breaks, right? Programming over the summer to accelerate learning and really mitigate the impacts of any learning or instructional sort of lost time throughout the past year. And learning recovery, and I really appreciate, I think I saw this in the Q&A, somebody sort of say, can we stop using learning loss, right? And I know at MDE, we're really trying to talk about accelerating learning and talking about learning recovery, right? Because students learned learned a lot this year, right? And we're really thinking about how do we accelerate learning, how do we recover, and how do we build back to better, right? As we think about long-term change and improvement in the system. And so we're trying to shift, right, the language intentionally that we use to learning recovery or accelerated learning. And this really is an opportunity to provide wraparound services, right, that support the whole child that have been mentioned. As Commissioner Mueller articulately, talked about, ensuring that students are safe, they're healthy, they're actively engaged, right? They're supported. They continue to be challenged regardless of sort of the experiences, right, that they faced this past year. And so we really encourage you all to think broadly about how you can use these new federal dollars, right, the ARP dollars, to really build those connections, right? And like I've mentioned, build sort of the infrastructure to respond to the immediate needs, but also, plan for needs that are going to outlast sort of our pandemic response right now. And so, really encouraging districts to think about deep and authentic community partnerships with state parks, right, to provide sort of some of that hands-on experiential learning, boys and girls clubs, right, YMCAs, right, that are across the state that I know stand ready because we hear about it, right, to partner with school districts to provide these sorts of opportunities, and thinking about full service community schools, right, and how that structure may be maybe sort of built or maybe expanded if there's something already sort of in the works to be sure that we are supporting the whole child, their mental health, their physical health, their social emotional health, right, their basic needs, and of course, the academic needs and accelerating learning. And so the law specifically talks about evidence-based full service community school structures as a really clear sort of option that we too encourage based on your sort of local needs assessment and the local context that you are working with your students and your families. And then it's been mentioned, we have longer period of time for these ARP dollars. And so you have until September 2024. And so I think we've all sort of been programmed this last year to think about spending the dollars now, right? Like the immediate needs now. And this is just sort of reiterate, right? Like such an opportunity to think about the next, 3.5+ years, and how do we strategically map out the use of these funds to build a sustainable long-term approach to meeting the needs of students and families within your school districts. And so those are a few pieces that sort of I would mention when it comes to really focusing on learning recovery for our students across Minnesota.
Patrice, could I ask a quick follow-up on that?
Yeah.
All of this is being told through the lens of the money coming from the feds to the state to the school district. Is there any option where a collection of out-of-school partners could come together and lead the initiative, or will the school district be able to be the sole decider on who's doing that wraparound work?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, RT. And as the commissioner had mentioned, 90% of these dollars are required to go out through the federal Title I formula, right? Straight to school districts. Now, that doesn't mean that school districts can't immediately turn around and partner, right? And even think about sub-grant opportunities, right? With local community organizations. And so we really encourage for that to happen. So even though it's, federal government to the state, straight to the LEA can immediately turn that around to engage in partnerships within folks within their communities. And then we do have this 9.5%, as well, that, as the commissioner had mentioned, is still, working through LAC approval and, and some of the specific pieces around how do we think about the 9.5% of the ARP dollars and what, partnerships might be, sort of possibilities, right, within the state activity sort of portion of those dollars, knowing that we are bound to 5% for instructional recovery, 1% for summer programming, and 1% for before or after school programming. But we know some of our community organizations are the ones that do those evidence-based programming the best, right? And so we are right now thinking through what does it look like to potentially create some partnerships at the state level to focus on those areas within the ARP law.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. And this one is sort of builds on that, this next question. People are curious about tutoring and like accelerating learning in school as well. So one of the strategies highlighted in the legislation includes relying on high quality tutoring. How should districts and schools be thinking about that and determining what constitutes high quality tutoring if they choose to work with an organization in their community?
That's great. Thanks for the question. And we know, that with high quality tutoring, it can really, again, accelerate learning for students. And it is, it is evidence-based when done, effectively. And so we really encourage for our districts and schools across the state to really consider a tiered system of support, right? When it comes to within school or out of school tutoring opportunities, and again, the accelerating of learning. And so some of these opportunities, I mean, folks on the call are familiar, right, with a tiered model. Some opportunities are available to all students. Others are designed, right, for more of the targeted learning, sort of needs. And then others may be designed for specific student groups, right? And I know Amy and others have sort of talked about some of the student groups that the ARP law really, really focuses on, right? Whether that be students from low-income families, students experiencing homelessness, our foster care youth, right? Our students of color and our Indigenous students and our students learning English, right? And so those are sort of ways to think about kind of a tiered system and where we might be able to focus on specific student groups. And so we encourage districts to really think kind of comprehensively, right, about what do those core supports look like for students, what do those strategic kind of interventions look like, and then which students really do need those more intense, sort of interventions to support their academic and social emotional well-being. And so these activities really can be embedded, right, in a program that centers, as I've talked about, on applied or experiential sort of learning opportunities, since those opportunities really were the ones that were lost, right, when students weren't able to engage kind of in that hands-on learning, right, alongside their peers. And so all of these options, I think, really support that concept of learning recovery in a meaningful way. And that would constitute high quality tutoring, right? And in-school acceleration opportunities for students.
Right. This one is related to distance learning. I mean, we know that some students have actually thrived with distance learning. And just so I'm wondering if there is any guidance that MDE or the staff from Senator Smith's office, if you have around if districts want to continue offering a remote option, can they use this funding to support developing a permanent remote option or a permanent distance learning option? Would that be allowable?
Well, I can jump in and then welcome Senator Smith's office as well. And so, the purpose of the ARP funds really is focused on, as articulated in the law, safely returning to school and ensuring safe in-person learning continues, right, for our students, as well as we've talked about, working on learning recovery. And so other funds would likely need to be used to support sort of a permanent remote school option, just given this purpose articulated in the federal law. And so as districts are creating plans for sort of this bucket of ARP funding, it's really important to consider the in-person learning, right, and the learning recovery needs, and of course, continuing to be intentional, right, in meeting the needs of sort of your local community, kind of in doing this. And so, there are those other pieces with, as we think about ESSER 1 and ESSER 2, right, the previous or sort of the current efforts that really were focused on digital learning and remote learning, right, where districts may have already or be in the process of kind of building an infrastructure that could kind of outlast the pandemic and pandemic recovery. But when it comes to ARP dollars, it's pretty clear that it is focused on safe in-person learning for our students across the state.
Well, we're sort of nearing the end of our time for this session. I just want to remind everyone again that we've been looking at the Q&A, looking at the chat, and we'll share that with others, with MDE staff, so they can follow up, and Senator Smith staff so they can follow up. I wanted to turn it over to the commissioner, if you would like to do any final remarks, and then we'll wrap up. We just want to be respectful of people's time, and the email address for MDE is in the chat.
Well, thank you very much, Patrice, and Brennan and Amy and Stephanie. Thank you for going through and answering those questions. I know that that oftentimes, honestly, we have been so used to functioning with very low funding that when there is a large influx of money coming into a school district or into a charter school, it can be incredibly overwhelming, because there are a lot of ways we have to be able to think about utilizing that, as well as recognizing that we don't want to build cliffs either. We don't want to be able to create a structure that is dependent on this money, and then we will not have the money later on. And so in being able to really look at how we're investing those funds continues to be incredibly important. And the work that I know that, at the federal level and Senator Smith has done in making sure that we are really thinking about how it is we are going to be able to close gaps for each and every student and our disparities, and give our students the world-class education that they deserve with caring and qualified teachers is something that the Minnesota has always, I think, prided itself in working toward. And I know that as school leaders and as educators across the state, this is the reason that we went into education, is because we are student-centered. We believe in each and every student, and we want to make sure that we are creating an environment where they have options in their lives, and at no point are we limiting what that would look like for them. These funds are one way for us to be able to really think creatively and innovatively in about how it is we're able to look at a system and structure that was not meant for all students. It was meant to sort students and to really revitalize and reform education as we know it. And so I appreciate all of the questions, and know that there are along the way. And we are going to continue to work and partner with our federal delegation, as well as our state legislators and our school leaders and educators and families and students, to make sure that as we are creating reform and as we are thinking about a student-centered approach and eliminating barriers, specifically looking at demographics as well as geographics, that we really continue to appreciate your partnership. And so I just really thankful for the opportunity to talk today and to engage in this. So thank you all very much.
Well, I want to thank the commissioner and the senator and 3 amazing staff people who have tremendous knowledge, who, by the way, are offering to continue to be a resource. And really want to thank our partner, the Graves Foundation, that does such incredible on-the-ground work and deeply, deeply committed to education. There's a bridge you go when you go down 94 and leave the city. And the last bridge before you leave the city is a really good bridge. It was built with funds from the Recovery Act in 2009. The reason I raise this is that when I go by that bridge, I feel remorseful because the bridge is just like any other bridge. We didn't have time to figure out bike lanes or new materials that would be sustainable or green because the Recovery Act in 2009 was about shovel ready. You can't rethink, you just got to go spend it. The biggest thing I'm taking out of this conversation is we're not about building the bridge the same way. We're about doing this better and differently. And I think that idea that we don't have to rush out and put everything into a summer program helter-skelter. We've really got to use this opportunity to think about those 1 or 2 time investments that change the system in a big way. And I just find this incredibly energizing and a huge responsibility. You know, as somebody who's probably older than most of the people on this call, we will probably not ever get an opportunity like this in our careers to do such systems change on looking at social emotional development, on tying together our out of school partners, on diversifying the classroom, and anti-racist curriculum. I mean, all of these things that we wanted to do, and as the commissioner said, we're used to operating with no money. We got to think really differently. I'm not saying to be slow. I'm saying let's be really, really systemic. So thanks for the time. This is the beginning of a discussion, and we want you to stay in touch with our Reimagine education work at the foundation. And please send us an email or go to our website and sign up to get your updates. More than anything, I want to thank my leader on this work, Patrice Relaford, who put this together and has done such great work for us in the foundation. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. And again, the MD email address is in the chat. Thanks, everybody.